Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Hello and welcome to yet another edition of the SoftCover, the ThePrint SoftCover that virtually launches interesting books. And today we have a book called A New Cold War, Henry Kissinger and the Rise of China. It's a Harper Collins publication, and I have an interesting panel with me as well. But before that, let me show the viewers. It's the book, nicely wrapped. We are going to unveil it. I have mine right here.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much, Suhasini.
Mine is lying in the other room. I'm sorry.
So it's a fascinating cover,
Amazon warehouse.
Oh, yeah, yours is yet to get there.
Sure. So let me welcome my the panelists that I have here, although this is a collection of critical essays of several veteran writers. But I have with me today Mr. Rahul Sharma. He's one of the editors of the book, along with Dr. Sanjaya. I have Ambassador Teresita Schaffer with me. She's been a diplomat for over 30 years now, of course, retired, but she's a well-known figure in India. We have Suhasini Haidar with us. She's the diplomatic and national editor of The Hindu. And we will be joined most probably by Dr. Grare, but welcome so much for this edition of the SoftCover. Let me just start with you, Mr. Sharma. If I can understand from you, you are really the essay that you have written. You've dealt a lot with the with the present happenings, if I can say so, especially with the coronavirus, the One Belt, One Road initiative, and basically the Belt and Road initiative. So if you can shed some light on the essay that you have written.
So I think, Henry Kissinger has always been a very fascinating subject for a lot of people, long shadows on US foreign policy, long shadows of his stint in the US government, which wasn't very long, but, in various parts of the world, including India. And 1971 was a very critical year in many ways. And a lot of things happened at that point in time, which led to where we are today, actually, if you really look at it. So I think from where it all started 50 years ago, and that was also the idea of the book, because obviously anniversaries make for a good reason to go back and see, how the world has been impacted. And Kissinger's visit, which was remarkable in many sense, though it was actually Nixon's idea, but somehow it became something very close to Kissinger, who continued to be involved with China and issues around China for a long, long time. And I think where we are today, and this is what lots of the essays in the book look at. But I think where we are today, when we look at China, and the fact is that China is actually today not competing, but challenging the United States. And the challenge is real. It's real for the world. It's real for us in India. It is real for the United States too. And within that is, if you really look at it, the period starting 2012, 2013, when Xi Jinping took over the leadership and became the president, as well as now he holds various other positions in the Chinese government and the party. What transpired since then and what you see today is the arrival of a much more muscular China, which is pushing itself in a manner which was not happening when the United States was reaching out to China back in 1971. So I think it's been a culmination of various things that have happened over the period of time. But if you really look at it in the last 7-8 years, the way China has emerged and become a challenger, that's the fascinating part. And One Belt, One Road has been a dream project, right? Where it is going to go or where it is now is still a question mark. But eventually what is going to happen, as I mentioned in the essay to some point, is that the United States, as well as the rest of the world, has to come to terms with China and has to come up with some kind of a strategy to make sure that it is in a position to balance things out.
Mhm. Well, what interests me is the fact that how you have called the article that you've written "Secret, Subterfuge, and Subordination," and you also deal with what, in your language, you call it as the Kissingerian approach, is what is a result of America's own deficiencies. So, if you can elaborate that bit a bit more for our viewers.
I think what I'm talking about here is the US, in my opinion, got seriously outfoxed by China. And Chinese used certain weaknesses in the American system, and also this whole American, desire, to get close to what was seen to be Orientalism, and it was kind of, something very different from what America was and continues to be. All that came together, and China, and James Mann has written this excellent book in the late 90s, wherein he's talking about various different American officials visiting Beijing and being taken, and none of them knew about each other, right? One part of the US government had no idea what the other part of the US government was doing vis-a-vis China was concerned. So I think it all started very secretively. It continued to be a secret because many people in the administration didn't know. There was a small bunch of people that kept doing stuff as years went on. And eventually, we have reached the point we have reached today, whereas the United States realizes that it didn't really understand China. It didn't really understand where China was trying to go, what it was trying to do. For the US at that point in time, and I think Ambassador Schaffer talks about it in her article, in her essay, is that there was from a tripolar world it became, from a bipolar world it became a tripolar world, and then it became eventually a unipolar world. But now we are again in a bipolar situation. So world has changed, and we'll keep evolving.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's interesting. And Ambassador Schaffer, if I can come to you next, and thankfully, Mr. Sharma really talks about what I wanted to ask you is about how to deal with this end of bipolar division of the world, the visit, the historical visit, you call it the secret visit by Kissinger in July 1971. Do you really think that ended the bipolar division of the world and what it is today?
I think the story is a little more complicated than that. The bipolar division of the world refers to the US and the Soviet Union as the poles. And to a large extent, they remained so. What Kissinger's approach to China and Nixon's decision to open up to China did was to introduce a third element. And Kissinger, as I wrote, had been fascinated by the balance of power. And he had very firm ideas on what had to constitute a balance of power, including an odd number of countries, so that there could always be the two biggies and a balancer. And China was the balancer. And China came in on the side of the US in what was clearly an anti-Soviet move on the part of the United States. So that's where you get to three. But China was not the equal of the US or the Soviet Union in terms of the size of its nuclear arsenal. Mm-hmm. China hadn't yet outpaced the Soviet Union economically, as it did fairly soon thereafter. The unipolar moment was just that. It was a brief period when the Soviet Union had collapsed and its economy had collapsed. And China hadn't yet been recognized as a global economic superpower, which it pretty much has now. So you now have, when people speak of a bipolar situation now, they're talking primarily about the US and China. But that model oversimplifies the fact that the Soviet Union, while still economically way behind those two, has figured out how to run a rather manipulative policy that is a significant challenge for the United States on the global stage. The Biden administration says, and I think they're correct in this, that China is the biggest challenge. And that's partly because of gaps in our understanding. But I think the gaps are on both sides. Henry Kissinger was very proud of his understanding of the Chinese leaders, and particularly of Mao and Zhou Enlai. But he didn't really claim to understand thousands of years of Chinese culture. I think he flattered himself that because he understood the leaders and because it was an autocratic system, he didn't really need that, or it wasn't a gap. And in any case, he did have on his staff some people who could make that claim. Mm-hmm. So you have significant gaps in US understanding, although I dare say we understand China better now than we did in 1971 as a sort of collectivity. But there are also gaps in understanding on the Chinese side. There is a Chinese scholar who's been publishing a lot of stuff about the strategic mistrust between the United States and China. And one of the points he makes, which is borne out by my experience, is that China basically doesn't distinguish between what the government says, does, and thinks, and the actions of the private sector, of different parts of the bureaucracy way down the chain of command,
sure.
or of the Senate, so that there are gaps in understanding on both sides, and they both pose something of a danger to the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. Schaffer, it's interesting that you also bring in the fact that not just political, this also had ramifications as far as China's economic rise is concerned, and you deal with the fact that, and Dr. Grare also deals with this in his essay about China's entry at the World Trade Organization in 2001, and how that has sort of been a complete game changer. Can you throw some light on that as well?
Are you asking me?
Yes, please.
Okay. China's economy grew, and it grew tremendously. It was an extraordinary success for the Chinese. They made the decision at two different points to join the global economic organizations from which the formerly communist and still communist countries had previously been excluded. So they joined the World Bank and the IMF and that group of financial organizations in the 1980s, and they joined the World Trade Organization in 2001.
Right.
Joining the World Trade Organization is actually a negotiation in which the applying country agrees on the ground rules for their joining. It's not a sort of an open and shut case.
Sure.
So all of these things wound up helping China accelerate its economic growth.
Right.
And for that reason, there are some people, and the current Indian foreign minister is one of them, who argue that the United States is significantly responsible for China's economic growth.
Right.
I would argue that the Chinese are really responsible for that. They did a very good job.
Sure, that's very interesting. So if I can come to you next, you really bring in the Pakistan factor to it, and how the Pressler arrangement, it also had an impact, the Cold War years. So if you would like to discuss your essay that you have written and basically how it brought US and Pakistan together.
Sure. And, Nayanima, somewhere there we have to recognize that if we are looking at 50 years of a visit, It is impossible to know what your future is. It is impossible to know what your present is if you don't really look at the past in a clear-eyed manner and see what exactly was done by the various players at that time. You mentioned that I looked at the Pakistan angle. I didn't actually just look at the Pakistan angle. I'm looking at how those moments, just the fact that Kissinger used Pakistan as a conduit to get to China, how that impacted and changed the course of South Asian history, changed the course of alignments in this region, changed our memories. You just have to sort of unpack a little bit. It all, if you ask me, really comes together with one memo. It's a memo that Kissinger writes to Nixon in April of 1971, so a little over 50 years, in which he says policy options for Pakistan. This is very euphemistic language. It is put out despite the fact that the blood telegrams had already come in, talking about the kind of, not just devastation from the cyclones in East Pakistan as it was known then, but the beginnings of Operation Searchlight, where the Pakistani army carried out the most brutal crackdown across Bangladesh. It was very clear that while India wasn't openly talking about supporting Bangladesh, the arming and the beginnings of the Mukti Bahini were already underway. So in this memo, Kissinger writes to Nixon and says, okay, so I'm making it easy for you. I'm giving you 3 policy options. And I'm simplifying what he said. But the 3 policy options were, we support Pakistan completely. We support Pakistan, but make it clear it's non-defense and military oriented. And the third, we remain genuinely neutral and let history play its part out. But of course, that will mean that India will, necessarily invade East Pakistan and separate it from West Pakistan. Nixon's response, and it's a handwritten note, and I'm not sure so many people of this generation may even know about something like this. But Nixon's response is very clear over there, where he says, essentially, he checks the option to support Pakistan completely. And he says, to all hands. So he's not just telling Kissinger, he's telling anyone who has access to that memo, to all hands, don't squeeze Yahya at this time. Now, at this time refers to the opening with China. And it is a decision that actually changes so much. I start my chapter really by saying, well, what if they had decided on Romania as a conduit? Right. And they were actually considering it. The truth is that the letters that went from Zhou Enlai responding to Nixon's original outreach went to both Pakistan, to Yahya Khan, and to Romania. But in Romania, because of the tight secret service and people, conjecture the Soviet influence there, it took more than a month later for that response to reach, whereas Yahya Khan was already there figuratively in Washington. He'd sent this with his ambassador and essentially sealed the deal for Pakistan. Why did it have such a huge impact? To begin with, the US had this idea that Pakistan must not be squeezed. It's language we've heard over the decades, that Pakistan must not be squeezed because the US has some other agenda in this region. But at that time, it was very specific for China. It had an impact in the East Pakistan equation, of course, and the creation of Bangladesh. So that was a huge thing that emerged out of that particular year, because it was building up of the year and the US wasn't paying so much attention to what was happening in Bangladesh. And others perhaps were not as well realizing where this was going to lead. It changed India-Pakistan relations was the course of the future. Even today, people in Pakistan will tell you, well, you broke up our country. So it changed that. Even things like problems with Sri Lanka that gave right for flights to go through from Pakistan to Bangladesh or East Pakistan at the time. It most importantly changed Indira Gandhi's dynamics. She was already working on some kind of a deal with the Soviets, but then she signed the Indo-Soviet Friendship Treaty, and much of it was because of the insecurity they felt as they could see that the US was also taking sides. The US not only sent in that 6th Fleet, which is of course legend, and even just 2 months ago, when the FONOP operations happened, the US Navy came very close into Indian waters. I remember people started talking about 50 years ago again. It possibly led to Indira Gandhi deciding that she could carry out nuclear tests after that. There's so many sort of reactions and a sort of domino effect on so many parts of what happened in South Asia in that 1 year or 2 years that changed the course of history. One of the big things that I write about is that the subsequent war with Pakistan, the fact that despite the US doing everything it can to stop India, despite the US actually at that time, in another conversation, Nixon tells Kissinger, can't we get the Chinese to drum up a few PLA battalions and send them to its frontier with India at Ladakh? Now compare that to today's position in 2021, where the US is actually trying to help India with the invasion from the incursions from the Chinese PLA at the line of actual control in Ladakh. So there's so much of this history that needs to be unpeeled. That moment changed the course of so much in South Asia. I think it's necessary to be looked at. That idea that India became the predominant power in South Asia, it wasn't challenged by China. China didn't think it was worth it to get into this fight. It wasn't. It successfully staved off the American challenge to its plans in Bangladesh. And as a result, other neighbors as well started to look at India in a way perhaps they hadn't looked in the past. So that's a little bit about what I've written about. I've also written about what it means in present times. But it's about unpacking history, comparing what happened then with what is the truth now, and also to see how we got.
Sure. That's what I was coming to you next, is about the new partnership that you talk about. And you really feel that whatever had happened in 1971 still has a resonance. So if you can share a little bit on that as well.
I think there is this constant idea of when will, the US and India come clean on their relationship, and India in particular, the idea that, is India practically an ally of the US, and why isn't it an ally of the US? All of those questions are, they're all almost always blamed on the non-aligned movement. But many of those came from a public reaction to what the United States did during that year. Turned a blind eye to the horrible brutalities of Bangladesh, really pumped up Pakistan, kept that relationship going, reached out to China and, almost ignored India in the process. The point is that there is some residual mistrust that ensures that India doesn't necessarily feel completely comfortable. I don't think that's a huge part of our nation's belief. Mostly the belief towards America is a positive one, that the United States has been a friendly country and a very important partner in so many different ways. But crossing that last bit of the Rubicon, I think, gets held back when you remember things of the past. And as I pointed out, despite how closely our navies work together, despite how closely we are engaged on the Indo-Pacific, one memo from the US Navy talking about carrying out FONUPs, which is freedom of naval patrols in the Arabian Sea, in the Indian Ocean, worked people up to quite the way they did in April this year. Means there is some residue, sort of worry about what the US could do when its interests are engaged elsewhere. I think some of it also plays out in the way the US has really cut a deal with the Taliban, asked Pakistan for help with that. When it comes to Afghanistan, I haven't dealt with that, but I do think it's a fascinating subject because inherently the two countries are democracies, the two countries trust each other. You have to just see any India-US meeting to see the kind of bonding between leaders of the two sides. But where does that one bit where we don't meet come from? Why is it we don't cross that Rubicon? And I think the answers lie in 1971 to a large extent.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, at this stage, let's welcome Dr. Frédéric Grare. I think he's just joined us. He's a senior fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations and a non-resident senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment. Welcome to the ThePrint SoftCover, Dr. Grare.
Oh, good afternoon. I don't know. Yes, good afternoon.
Well, I was just discussing with Ambassador Schaffer, and something that you've also dealt with in your article is how China's entry at the World Trade Organization in 2001, which is not really much discussed about, but that also had an implication on how the way China is behaving today. So if you can shed some light on that, and then I'll of course come on your other aspects that you've dealt with.
No, I mean, there's not much to say because Schaffer has already said it all. The entry of China in the WTO is of huge consequences for the Chinese economy and so on. What was interesting and what I tried to highlight in my own chapter is that it was definitely an unintended outcome. Certainly nobody anticipated that China would be that successful. And if you read the statements by President Clinton of the time and so on, clearly things went probably on some field the opposite way than was expected in terms of consequences for the American economy, for employment in the US and so on. These are the kind of big steps that led China where it is now. But I mean, what I'm trying to do all over the chapter is demonstrate that there is no such thing as a linear rationality, which leads from point A to point Z. This is something that can be reconstructed afterward, but find absolutely no evidence in the actual conduct of operations. So we have seen, yes, a number of very successful years for the Chinese economy. You also have to realize where it started, and I'm referring to what we are celebrating today, that is the visit of Henry Kissinger to China. China is at the time a third world country, which is still in the Cultural Revolution tumult and unlikely to achieve anything anytime soon, and therefore can be dealt with for purely strategic reason, again, as Stacey demonstrated, in an anti-Soviet move, but it cannot be expected to become what it later became simply because it came at a cost of a second cultural revolution, which was an economic one, this time radically opposite to what we had seen in the 60s and 70s, but which led the country to much more, how could I say, reasonable economic path, a very gradual and yet very fast process and so on. That's what we saw over time. And all I was trying to demonstrate is that this reconstruction is by no means sort of an anti-India conspiracy as seems to pop up here and there, at least not by intent, but at least as a consequence of what I just heard. And second, and I don't remember what that second point was essentially as the ultimate result of a series of moves. Each of them was very uncertain and did not guarantee any success at any point.
Mm-hmm. Well, you also deal with the fact that how in India, China has had been seen as this existential threat since the 1962 border conflict. I'm sure you're also watching what's happening between India and China since April 2020 with the Ladakh border standoff. So what do you have to say to that? Do you think that that threat is for real, or do you think India get over with it?
No, the threat is for real, but the only continuity that we can see between 62 and now is the persistence of a level of mistrust, the intensification of the rivalry because the capacity of both countries has increased. There is a rivalry for status in Asia and so on and so forth, and definitely a growing assertiveness on China, and I don't need to demonstrate that here. But I mean, you cannot establish, again, a pure continuity between 62 and 2020. The threat in 2020 is very real. We are probably at a turning point in the relations between India and China. But again, in between, you have had ups and downs in the relationship, starting with the Rajiv Gandhi visit in China in the 80s and so on and so forth, and a slow and incremental process which led to the slow building up of trust between the two countries. How much trust, I don't know. How far was it meant to go? I don't know. But I mean, yet the process suddenly experienced sort of a breakup with the arrival of Xi Jinping. I don't know again if this was intended, but this corresponded to the arrival of Xi Jinping, and this is where we are now. We are again into after 2020 in the very uncertain certain place, and as to where the relation is going. At least I'm not able to say where the relation will really go. But again, what I want to say is simply that you cannot infer a simple continuity from point A to point Z, because this is just not the way things evolve in reality.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's interesting. I'll come back to you again, maybe on what you said. Mr. Sharma, if I can come to you now, you also talk about in your chapter called Clandestine Diplomacy, and you also deal on the fact that how things have changed from Deng Xiaoping to Xi Jinping. Would you like to discuss a little bit on that as well? That's quite interesting.
I think if you look at the reality, how China conducted itself till at least the arrival of Xi Jinping, if you look at late 70s, early 80s, and what Frédéric was saying, China was still a third world country. It was not economically developed. It had a lot of other issues to deal with. It was coming out of the Cultural Revolution. There was obviously a lot of social strains over there. And in between that, they had to rebuild themselves and keep in mind the long-term goal, which I think China has always had, that it wants to be where it really wants to be, which is, the big guy in town, and there's nothing wrong with it. But the journey that China made, and I think the most critical part, which again, Ambassador Schaffer and Frédéric talked about, post-WTO, the way things changed for China and the kind of economic growth that it got, a lot of it helped by the Americans. Let's be honest about it, right? Starting from when large American corporations started going into China, setting up shop, and China eventually becoming the factory not only to the United States but eventually to the world. The journey for China has been fascinating in many ways, because economically it has reached a point where it is in some way or the other can be considered to be the largest economy in the world if you look at various factors and various measurements. But what is happening today is also fascinating, because you see Xi Jinping consolidating power in a manner which only Mao had in the past. And that gives him the ability to challenge not only things internally, but also make that push that China is making very aggressively to tell the world that it is going to do what it set out to do, which is becoming the big power. I think that journey is fascinating. That journey, how it made the journey, is very, very interesting. And of course, the critical part is where things go from now. Whether Xi Jinping continues in power after 10 years, having made the changes that have been made, or there is somebody else who comes in his place, and how China then evolves from there. These are still open-ended questions. But I think the journey has been fascinating. It's just something that there's a lot to learn from in many ways, and it also opens up different possibilities for different nations.
Mm-hmm. You also talk about the fact that the Kissingerian approach it survived for so many years because he acted like this godfather, and he had men around him, and his policies and his approach was discussed over the years. Do you think that was a good stance, or you think that that was counterproductive?
I think his influence was long-lasting, and therefore the way American diplomacy and looked at China was shadowed by his thought process, because people who worked with him continued to be in the system for a long time. And I think Sanjaya makes a very interesting point in his essay, where he talks about how then Kissinger got involved continued to stay involved with China in many ways. And, through his, and that's what Sanjay is talking about, that through his own consultancy, how he kind of became a bridge between United States and China. And it was pretty obvious because every time there was a new Chinese president, the one person he would definitely go to for advice was Kissinger, number one. Number two, if you look at after the Tiananmen Square, event that happened, it was interesting to see both Nixon and Kissinger making a visit, and they were not in office. They were people who were out of the government, but at that point in time, they did go down to Beijing to have conversations. So the point I'm trying to make in my essay is that the Kissingerian influence continued in the American diplomatic system for a long time because there were people who worked under him, were influenced by him, and they tend to look at China the way he did. Whether it was from the larger American perspective or it was from an individual perspective. So that obviously influenced the way America looked at China.
Right. Quite interesting. Ambassador Schaffer, if I can come to you now, you really asked the key question: did the Kissinger visit bring about the rise of China? While you deal with it in your article, in a quite an insightful way, if you can tell me in your own words, and I'm sure our viewers would also love to hear from you, that was that really the so-called door opening that the world had towards China? Was it good for the world? Was it bad for the world, to put it simply?
I think that the U.S. opening to China was an important door opening. I won't say that China couldn't have made economic progress without it, but it certainly, first of all, gave them a burst of publicity. Secondly, when you couple it with decisions that their government made about joining the world's organizations that actually provide some assistance if you want to strengthen your ability to buy and sell goods on the world market. Those decisions, when taken against the background of the door opening, provided the raw materials that China need in order to make itself an economic powerhouse. Now, what does that mean? It has a tremendously productive economy, but it is not omni-capable. No one is. And you've seen in recent years that there have been concerns about where the economy was going. And I think this kind of thing will happen again. So that they are subject to the ups and downs of economic cycles and so on, just like anybody else. They also, in spite of having joined the various world economic organizations, don't entirely accept the standards by which countries are supposed to operate on the international stage. I'm putting supposed to in inverted commas there. But there are some fairly widespread norms, and China doesn't necessarily accept them. The most obvious example at this point is respect for intellectual property rights. Now, mind you, the US has picked fights over intellectual property rights with many countries. China is by no means the only one. But China is the one where the government has so firmly stood behind a intellectual property regime, which appears to be aimed at liberating as much intellectual property as they can get away with from their trading partners. And I mention this because I've been involved recently in a project that is looking at the impending change or the change that's underway in the world order. And one of the things, and it's looking specifically at India, China, and the United States. And one of the things that keeps coming up in many different ways is that China is increasingly eager to change these, in some cases, unwritten rules. And I think that's something you're going to see a lot more of. I would also argue that certainly parts of my article have become outdated in the time since I finished writing it. And I suspect that I'm not the only one, because you have so many more things going on, because China's policies are evolving fairly quickly. All of my genuine China watcher friends agree that China's substantial presence in the Indian Ocean is happening much more quickly than they expected, for example. And you've seen relations between China and both India and the US go downhill at a rapid clip. In the case of India, it was the clashes on the border. In the case of the United States, it was more of an economic competition, but China's response has been different. Instead of just sort of biding their time, they are issuing very sharp verbal responses. And it's quite clear that this is not an accident. This is something that's continued quite consistently. The Bangladeshis, I think, were quite shocked when the Chinese ambassador to Bangladesh publicly warned Bangladesh against having any interest in joining the Quad. As far as I know, that subject has never come up within the Quad. And the Chinese were, the Bangladeshis were offended and told the Chinese so. But the Chinese felt free to make gratuitous comments about third country issues. And that's something that might not have happened a few years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So we're looking at a moving target.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting, Ambassador Schaffer. If I can ask you also on the fact that, how do you think going forward the Chinese will look into the Quad or the Indo-Pacific strategy, despite the fact that all the stakeholders keep talking about the fact that we recently had Secretary of State Blinken visiting India in his first maiden visit, where he said that the Quad is not a military alliance. Do you think the Chinese are going to believe that? And do you think they're going to change their ways? India is looking at inducting Russia within the Indo-Pacific. I don't know if that will be ever successful. But how do you think the Xi Jinping administration is going to really absorb all this?
Well, all I can say is that this other project that I mentioned has had 4 meetings. And in each one of those, the Chinese speakers, without exception, found occasion to complain about the Quad. So this is obviously something that's a little bit gotten under their skin. And this is all of a piece. They are voicing their unhappiness, and countries in their extended neighborhood seem to be making common cause and interpreting that common cause as being anti-Chinese. Now, in some cases, that interpretation is probably correct, but in other cases, probably not. There is a kind of reflexive mistrust. And the same thing happens on the US side, but for the moment, I'm talking about what I've read about perceptions in Chinese elite and government circles.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Suhasini, if I can come to you again and ask you about what you make of President Xi Jinping's speech, when during the centenary celebrations of the Chinese Communist Party. There's been so many versions that we've heard. What do you have to say? What is your take on that?
Well, I definitely think that, as Rahul pointed out, we don't yet know what this history is going to be. What the future is going to be in the next decade. Is Xi Jinping still going to be able to hold that control of China, given the kind of myriad ways in which China has multiplied its adversaries, has really squeezed on the number of friends it still has, and on in the ways in which it has begun new kinds of aggression. And I'm not just mentioning the LAC or what China is doing in the South China Sea, or what we've seen its attitude towards Taiwan, but also just this wolf warrior kind of attitude in various capitals that has clearly upset countries that in the past were willing to put aside. So again, to come back to the book and its thesis about how the Kissinger outreach really changed China's future, that whole idea of bringing China into the fold, bringing China into a world sort of engagement so that it would move towards a more, what is the word, not conciliatory, but a cooperative framework. It is negating all of that. It is negating what the world thought that China would do when the US began to engage with it, and then the entry into WTO, as so many speakers have mentioned. So when Mr. Xi Jinping comes at the 100 years of CCP and essentially says that we will continue to do this, is not reaching out in any way and trying to give an explanation for China's behavior, I think he's not only sending a message externally, but there is a message that has gone internally, that this is the way it's going to be. Obviously, China has its own internal problems, whether it is its worries about security situations in Xinjiang, in Tibet, in Hong Kong as well. But I think to have a leadership at this time who is so different, possibly from the leadership we saw in the early 90s, perhaps, or even the leadership of 1971 that was looking to forge this opening with the US. I think you're actually going to see history play out in the next few years as well. So when it comes to the speech itself, the idea that he said China will not be oppressed, the idea that he constantly talks in terms of the
wall of steel.
Yes, exactly. Or that foreign powers will get, I don't know if this is an accurate translation, but it's the translation we get. Foreign powers will get their heads bashed if they attempt to bully China. I think per force, they are pushing themselves into a situation which is so the opposite of what it was 50 years ago. And therefore are necessarily closing the doors on a lot of opportunities. Now, whether that will work badly for themselves internally or not, that's something that remains to be seen. After all, the past decade has been seen as the decade of alpha men around the world, whether it was in democracies, whether it was in authoritarian regimes and communist regimes. The fact is that we've seen a huge rise of the alpha men. Are alpha men going to continue to be able to rise, or at some point are they going to internally face a challenge to this necessarily, angry way of dealing with the world? And I think the kind of reaction to the coronavirus pandemic, obviously nobody would normally blame a country for a pandemic. But the kind of reactions it's engendered, and then China's own reaction to whether it was a WHO investigation or to telling the world what had happened, delaying telling the world, these are all symptoms of what we were talking about, and also what has come out really in that speech that President Xi Jinping gave.
Right. Suhasini, one last thing, if I can ask you, do you feel in that case, and since I have covered it, and of course so have you, the fact that this so-called informal visits that Prime Minister Modi, informal summit, that he had with President Xi, so much was written about it, so much was talked about, we've written about it, it was necessary for a heart-to-heart understanding of each other. And then Prime Minister Modi having India walk out of the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Do you think that probably India has now realized that if you really deal with the dragon that is China, you need to have a completely different approach? What's your thought on that?
Well, you mentioned these personal summits, and obviously what happened 50 years ago also was about, personalization, in a sense, of these bilateral relationships. That just does not work. Relationships have to be built on so much more of an understanding of the two countries, their systems, in the ways in which they can benefit each other, than the word of two men, two women, or two leaders, basically. That I think straight away over there is essentially, I think the problem has been seen. After all, Prime Minister Modi and President Xi met as many as 18 times in the period of 6 years that Prime Minister Modi's tenure has happened, and two of them, as you pointed out, were these very long, 6-8 hours at a time together. And yet, since the problems occurred after the Chinese transgressions at the LAC, they have not spoken even once.
At least publicly, we don't know.
About COVID relief, yeah, that's true. About COVID relief, I think in early April or late March. And after that, we have not seen them even reach out to each other. So what does that prove? That proves that while things are okay, it is possible for this leader-to-leader relationship to work, but that kind of falls apart when the moment you have real trouble in the relationship. I think there is a mismatch of expectations on both sides. India's expectations from China, China's expectations from India have not really panned out. Whether it was China's expectations from India in the economic sphere or in the sphere where China felt India must not challenge China, so the Quad, for example, or India's expectations that China will not aggress India in its three spheres, so the bilateral sphere or the boundary between the two countries. It will not aggress when it comes to the maritime sphere, and it will not aggress, and this is something I deal with in my chapter, in India's sphere of influence, which is essentially the Indian subcontinent minus Pakistan. Right. And China has now shown that it is willing to do each of those. Since the early 2010s, China began to build its Blue Water Navy. It now sends out these missions. They sent that mission of 2 warships to Maldives a few years ago that caused quite a lot of consternation in India. Also, the nuclear submarines to Sri Lanka. We've seen the aggression at the LAC. And of course, now, if you take it bit by bit, China seems to be engaging South Asia as a whole. Most recently, they have created a poverty alleviation center that essentially takes so much of India's neighborhood, minus Bhutan and Maldives, into it. That India is definitely feeling that China has breached that expectation of 2 Asian giants growing together and not necessarily clashing with each other.
Right, right. Well, thanks for that. And Dr. Grare, now if I can finally ask you, and you will probably have the last word on the fact that you categorically say one factor is that China's economic rise has not really led to greater political freedom. When you say that, I would really want to ask you how to see the future of the Chinese Communist Party for the next 50 or 100 years?
Well, I used to say that I did a PhD in international relations, not in astrology, and therefore I don't know what the future of the Communist Party holds for itself. Nevertheless, I think that we spoke of the WTO, we spoke of various things over the past. The idea that was precisely prevalent at the time when China joined the WTO is that economic prosperity would inevitably bring political freedom. This has not been the case. What we see today is a different path. On the contrary, economic prosperity seems to legitimize autocracy. The question is perhaps, the answer to your question lies perhaps in between. Will economic prosperity continue? He again has mentioned that, there are economic cycle in China like everywhere else, and they're unlikely to experience the kind of growth that they did over the past 30 years or 40 years now in the same way than they did. Will the Chinese Communist Party be able to maintain control? That's a different story. The sort of de facto social contract between the population and the party may be threatened at times. I don't think that we are there, and therefore we can anticipate the party to continue its leadership for a while, but no one can guarantee that it will last forever. But at the right now, all we can say is that there are factors that points in a potentially uncertain direction. I'm talking of the demography. I'm talking of the economic cycles that we are referring to. I'm talking of the inability of China to get out of the middle income trap eventually, and so on and so forth. So that's where we are right now. And it may have sort of a sequence reaction. It may lead to a tighter control of the Communist Party and a successful tighter control of the Communist Party over the society for a while, and may force it out later on as things move on and the population stop fearing it because they do not all their side of the contract with the society. I mean, that's a bit confused, I know, and I apologize for that, but that's all I can say right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much. On that note, let me show the book again. This is A New Cold War. It's a Harper Collins publication, Henry Kissinger and the Rise of China, edited by Dr. Sanjaya Baru and Mr. Rahul Sharma. This was the print softcover edition. Thank you to all my panelists for joining in, and all the best. Congratulations. I know the book is doing well, but I'm sure once readers start grabbing a copy of this, they'll understand the depth of it. Thank you so much for joining in.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nayanima. Thank you.